thank you all for inviting me. I understand that much of the conference is connected to what should I call it? AI and artificial intelligence and other areas, which I must say I'm not entirely an expert on them. At the age of 70, I hardly come to terms with Facebook and still battles with Instagram and TikTok, so let alone AI is not an easy platform for me, but
So
luckily...
it's very nice to introduce you to this community.
Yes, thank you. Luckily, I have two sons who are computer wizards, so I'm getting home education quite quickly and quite intensively. So I'm a bit better than I used to be. It is, if I understand correctly, and I hope I do, as I say, I'm a bit of a newcomer to this field, we are not yet at the phase of what one can call strong AI, strong artificial intelligence, namely artificial intelligence that possesses a consciousness and general intelligence at a human level. But probably it will happen sometime, and then the AI intervention or relevance to current problems such as the Palestine issue will become more relevant as a topic of discussion. But even in the present form, the AI claims to be a form of intelligence that is used to solve problems, come up with solutions, make predictions, and maybe even offer strategic ideas for the future. And there's a possibility it might apply, at least in the minds of quite a lot of people, with solutions to conflicts, such as the one in Palestine. There is another aim of AI, which I think is relevant to what we are discussing today, and this is to build a computer system that is capable of modeling human behavior so that it can use human-like thinking processes to solve complex problems. Again, in the future, it might relate to conflicts such as the one in Palestine. And finally, one part of the AI is the natural language processing, meant to truly understand human language, whether it's written or spoken, through interpretation, among other methods. So the key concept I would like to address in this context, I hope will show that language, if it is such an important part of the reservoir of ideas that AI is connected to and it is fed by, that language is anything but neutral in conflict situations such as the one evolving in Israel and Palestine. In fact, within the context of conflict, especially like the one that has been raging in historical Palestine for the last 100, if not more, years, language is a tool that can be employed either to humanize or to dehumanize the other side, if you want, the enemy, the rival party, or anyone supporting that party. So whoever searches for data which is not quantitative, that relates to this case study of Palestine and Israel, will have to be aware of the uses and abuses of language. The language I'm particularly interested in this respect is Hebrew. Although if I have time, I would say something about how English is used in this respect. And of course, one should relate to Arabic as well, and the various dialects of Arabic and so on, but there is a limit to what one can do within 40 minutes. But I'm particularly interested in the way Hebrew is used, and how will this usage affect any computerized attempt to use sources which are supposedly neutral, professional, academic, in helping people to form an argument, a counter-argument, an opinion, and as we said, maybe later in the future, policy papers and strategic suggestions that might even dare to suggest solutions for conflicts. The language, as I say, is Hebrew, and my main argument is that the Hebrew references in Israel, more specifically in Israeli academia, media, military, in the political system, any reference in Hebrew in all those institutions to the Palestinians from the days of the Palestinian Nakba, the 1948 catastrophe, and during that, the period in which the catastrophe unfolded, and during the ongoing Nakba, as I mentioned in the abstract, which is namely how we refer to the history of Israel's treatment of the Palestinians from 1948 until today, including the particular period since October 2023, that my main argument is that Hebrew references in all this historical spectrum is the language of dehumanization. And it's part of the eliminatory policies of the Zionist settler colonial project. Obviously, I'm working here on certain assumptions that not everyone, especially not everyone in the global West, would accept, although recently they are accepted by many scholars working on Israel and Palestine. And the most important of these assumptions that lead me to think about Hebrew in reference to Palestinian as an eliminatory tool is that, and the most important assumption for that is that Zionism is a settler colonial movement, and that Israeli policy towards the Palestinians, whether in 1948 or since 1948 until today, is informed by this ideology or paradigm of settler colonialism. Briefly, let me just repeat what probably many of you know. What is settler colonialism? It is the phenomenon of Europeans who were outcasts in Europe for various reasons, and who sought to rebuild Europe on someone else's land outside the European continent. They did it first with the help of colonial empires, but in many cases, these settlers formed their own national identity and rebelled against the empire and became independent states. The main obstacle for all the settler colonial movements was that they chose lands where other people already lived, and in order to build a new Europe instead of the Europe that didn't want them, they acted according to what the late scholar of settler colonialism, Patrick Wolf, called the logic of the elimination of the native, a logic that led to genocides in the Americas and in Australia. Palestinian scholars in the 1960s and more mainstream scholars in the 1990s applied this paradigm to Zionism. Jews were unwanted in Europe and believed they could build a European Jewish state in Palestine, and implemented it through a project of displacement and replacement. It began with small ethnic cleansing operations in the 1920s under the British mandate, mainly through land purchase from absentee lords, and culminated in the massive operation of ethnic cleansing in 1948, to which most of us refer as the Nakba, as the catastrophe, or the year of the catastrophe. The operations in 1948 began after the international community recognized the Jewish state in the partition resolution, resolution number 181 that was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly already on the 29th of November 1947. The new state's leaders, the leaders of the new state of Israel, expressed their wish to build a Jewish democracy and wanted to be regarded as part of the Western world. The operations in 1948 began, as I say, after that recognition was accorded by the international community through the United Nations, and after the Zionist leaders made their intention known in the world of how do they see the future Jewish state. Now, the democratic ideals, as well as the alleged adherence to new sets of international law that were established in the wake of the Holocaust, did not tally with the realities on the ground, or if you want, with the Israeli actions against the Palestinians on the ground. Ethnic cleansing accompanied by massacres and the wiping out of whole villages and neighborhoods, as well as the destruction of any artifact or landmark that could attest to the existence of Palestine before the creation of Israel. All these actions did not sit well with the claim of democracy or adherence to international law. This is when language became crucial to solve a kind of a cognitive dissonance, first and foremost for internal consumption. Many of the Jews who were part of the 1948 community were survivors of the Holocaust. Others came from Europe before the Second World War and had to be reassured the elimination of the Palestinians is as sacred as establishing a safe haven for the Jews in Palestine. The settler colonial nature of Zionism, or the Zionist project, inherently, like so many other settler colonial projects, included inherently the necessary approach for such a mission, and that is the approach of dehumanization. Dehumanizing the indigenous population was a precondition for its elimination, first of all, at the age of enlightenment, which corresponded to the age of colonialism, or at the age of the new democratic world that was established after the Second World War, that corresponded with the creation of the State of Israel. And dehumanization can only be conveyed, especially at that time, but probably also today, through language. The most important trope of that language that was meant to solve a certain dissonance or cognitive dissonance was the framing of all the Palestinian space of living, or habitat, if you want, in the countryside or in the urban space of Palestine, as an enemy-based. The moment the village or a neighborhood was called in Hebrew a hostile enemy base, everyone living in it was a soldier, a military person. This was the public image. The orders sent to the troops of the Jewish state during the Nakba were even more specific. Any male who was above the age of 10 was a military person or an enemy soldier that could be killed, wounded, or sent to a prison camp. But the village as a whole could be easily blown up and wiped out as a military base because it was framed as a military base. Now, the dictionary of the army was replicated by the local media in Hebrew in Israel at the time and reappeared, if you want, in the textbooks of the elementary school, of high school, in the discourse used in state ceremonies, in radio documentaries, and later in TV documentaries, in the museums and commemoration sites, as well as in popular fiction and non-fiction books on 1948. So this whole, what one can call it, militarization of the Palestinians as being part of a force, military force, regardless whether there were civilians or not, and therefore were legitimate object of destruction, was not only conveyed during the time of battle, but also in the recollection of the battle, in its historiography, in its remembrance. And therefore, it became engraved in the Israeli Jewish perception of the Palestinians for generations to come. There was an additional layer. There was more concrete dehumanization, if you want, of the Palestinians that emerged during the days of the Nakba and later on had its impact on other historical periods and more recent one. And that is something one can call the Nazification of the Palestinians. The language was used in order to equate in the minds of people the Palestinian political discourse and military actions as a continuation of the Nazi extermination machine that was employed by Germany during the Second World War. Later, a pool of images will be used to accentuate this point. For instance, some of you may remember that or know about this example. In 1982, the Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin compared Yasser Arafat, who was stranded in the bunker in Beirut, to Adolf Hitler in his last days in the bunker in Berlin in 1945. And in many ways, it was more than just militarizing through the language the Palestinians, or militarizing the whole population. It was framing them as members of terrorism, of terrorists. So it was more terrorizing them in a way. The Palestinian paramilitary groups before 1948 were called gangs. The ones that the guerrilla forces after 1948, of course, were also framed as terrorists. Their leaders were framed as murderers and robbers. And this kind of language was carried from 1948 to the next period in which Israel had to engage with collective Palestinian society. Between 1948 and 1966, Israel particularly dealt with two Palestinian communities, those who remained inside Israel. After 1948, it became known as the 48 Arabs, or the Arab minority in Israel, and those Palestinians in the refugee camps that tried to retrieve some of their possessions after they were expelled, and some who formed later a guerrilla movement, the Fidayun, in order to try and begin an anti-colonialist liberation struggle. The same reservoir or the same vocabulary, rather, used in 1948 was also used in order to describe these actions and the motives or the motivation behind that action. In the case of the 48 Arabs, what was very important is to remember that they were under military rule until 1966, a military rule that was based on colonialist British colonialist regulation that actually incarcerated a whole population in a kind of a big military jail, where the wardens were the military people themselves, who had absolute power over the people and the language. And we have the documentation, we have the memoirs and so on. The language reflects again this dehumanization through militarization of a whole population of people that allegedly were equal citizens in the Jewish state. Now, this system was transferred to the West Bank and the Gaza Strip after 1967, where any act of resistance, including nonviolent resistance, was framed in Hebrew as an act of terrorism. Gradually, the apprehensions from abroad, the criticism from abroad about the Israeli actual policy towards the people in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip transferred this vocabulary to English and became an important part of the Hasbara, the Israeli propaganda machine, in other foreign languages. Although I think the Israelis quickly learned that it didn't work that well in English as it worked in Hebrew. And part of the reason, I think, among other factors, that Israel's international image deteriorated was the inability to use in English and other foreign languages the same kind of vocabulary that may have sounded rational or moral even in the ears of Israeli use, but did not have a similar effect on more neutral audiences. Framing the Palestinian resistance as terrorism, describing the summary execution in the occupied West Bank and the Gaza Strip by the Israeli army as targeted elimination and political prisoners as criminals, all that was continued in all languages, but had less, as I say, was less effective outside Israel. But it's interesting to look at the attempt to launderette these actions of dispossession, killings, and ethnic cleansing. For example, expropriated land in the West Bank that meant to strangulate the living space of the Palestinians is described by the Israeli Foreign Ministry for all its generation as an ecological project of creating green lungs and similar euphemisms that the language is using. And if you trust more the Israeli sources of information through any algorithm or through any other technical method, you will encounter such explanation that have a way of hiding the reality on the ground. It is difficult to know, by the way, who are the persons who invented these words or this vocabulary, because at a certain stage, this mission was given to a computer in Israel. So much of the launderette of words used to describe the ruthless Israeli oppression towards the Palestinians is now the product of a computerized search for names, adjectives, verbs, and so on. But in particularly, and that is an interesting part of the story, for code names for operations that every now and then Israel carries out against the Palestinians, ruthless and brutal, that have the computer later on, especially when it came to actions against the Hamas and the Gaza Strip in this century, produce benign names for very cruel actions of bombardments and oppression. For instance, an operation against the Gaza Strip that included vast bombing from the air, the land, and the sea of civilian population was codenamed Autumn Rains, or another one was codenamed Summer Rains. This was a significant change from the codenames of operations during the Nakba, where the names more explicitly, more explicitly represented dehumanization and the intent to ethnically cleanse the population, such as Operation Broom, which included massive expulsion of Palestinians. I think one of the features of settler colonial studies is a colonial project, rather, settler colonial project, is that it's not a one-off event, but a structure. When it comes to language, there's a clear relations between the inability to complete the takeover of a land or getting rid of its population, mainly because of the resistance and the resilience of the colonized people, and the changes in the language used to describe the aims and the actions of the colonizer. So while there was confidence that Israel is finally managing to take over all of historical Palestine, from the river to the sea, and taming or policing the population in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, including the Palestinians inside Israel, to the point of domicile existence, the language remained metaphorical or euphemistic. So for a while, there was a confidence that Israel is finally managing the settler colonial project, and was reflected in the language that meant to protect it from any internal or external criticism. The 7th of October 23 was the turning point in this respect. The colonized did the unexpected, traumatized the colonizer's society, and cast doubt about the invincibility of its military forces, and therefore the overall success of the settler colonial project. I might want to nuance a little bit this last remark. The old Israeli elite, and whoever it represented in the Israeli Jewish society, in a way sensed what I just described, namely trauma and lack of confidence in the invincibility of the army and the whole validity of the Zionist project. The new elite that emerged in the settler communities in the West Bank mainly regarded the 7th of October as a necessary event on the way to a doomsday scenario, a kind of an Armageddon moment when Israel would face the forces of evil, and with God's help would defeat them and create an empire that would extend well beyond the borders of historical Palestine. Within the context we are analyzing here, whether from the trauma of the old elite or the vision of the new one, the political decision, in fact, maybe even the ideological decision, is that the elimination that in the past was not acknowledged publicly for domestic or external consumption, that was in many ways incremental, is now stated explicitly. Both its objective and the way the actions are described on the ground. So the language reflects today an Israeli official discourse and also a discourse of the society at large, of the Jewish society, of course, at large, that does not use euphemism, does not use implicit references to elimination of the native as a settler colonial project, but directly reflects the wish to eliminate. And this is a new phase in the language. It's not directly a new phase in the actions against the Palestinians, which the main intention was always to take as much as Palestine as possible with a few, and leave in it as few Palestinians as possible. But the language did not always reflected this kind of ambition. And I think it's first time in Israel's history that its eliminatory policies are described without filters in the discourse of the military, of the politicians, and to a certain extent in the local media. And this is why it was so easy for the South African team, alleging in front of the International Court of Justice that Israel commits a genocide in the Gaza Strip, to collect proof of the language used in order to show that this was the motivation for the genocide. So the argument of the South African team in the International Court of Justice was based on two levels. One level was describing what Israel is actually doing on the ground as acts of genocide, but also they felt the necessity to show that the language accompanying the action itself was genocidal. You probably remember, some of you, some of the expression used by leading Israeli politicians at the time, beginning with Benjamin Netanyahu, who talked about wiping the Amalek memory, which the Amalekites were the people genocided by the Hebrew tribe according to the Old Testament. So whenever you describe anyone as an Amalekite, it means that you're referring to God's directive to genocide a people. So it's not even a matter of self-defense. It's a matter of moral right to wipe out the whole nation. Gallant, the Minister of Defense, said, well, we are fighting animals. His successor said, no one would stay alive in Gaza. Another one said, let's drop an atom bomb on Gaza. And I mean, the list is too long and too troubling to mention. But what it means, it's just a direct and explicit eliminatory language by the highest echelons of the political system that we heard since the 7th of October. And this is why it was so easy for the South African team to make the case. In fact, they had the time that they would, if they had the time to do even a more profound research before they appeared in front of the court, which they didn't, they would have realized that it was not only the generals and the politicians who talked about the destruction of the whole population and referring to it as referring to the Palestinians, particularly in Gaza, as the Amalekites. But this was the discourse in most of the synagogues, which are not only houses of prayers in Israel, but also community centers. And you could also see similar conversation on the internet highway. So the whole verbal world of the Israelis was saturated with what seemed at the time as a legitimate conversation of genocide, of dehumanization and elimination that reflected not a temporal wish to that started on the 7th of October without any background, but actually a wish to complete what the previous stages of the settler colonial project have not managed to achieve because of the Palestinian resistance and resilience. What is very interesting about the internet highway at the time is that Meta's algorithm detected successfully any equation of Israeli actions with Nazism. I don't know if any of you have tried it or saw it, but you cannot, in most platforms, do the equation. Immediately you will be denied in English. But the same algorithm that did not censor any calls for massive killing or elimination of the Palestinians or the Muslims, either in Hebrew or in any other language. Thus, the total destruction of the Gaza Strip on the ground followed a discourse of total destruction. There is a sense that some of the liberty everyone took in Israel with such language has to do with the fact that the Israelis treat Hebrew as a secret language that nobody understands. But I think that even the more implicit language that dehumanizes the Palestinians that Israelis use in English cannot hide this kind of eliminatory discourse, not to mention the fact that, of course, Hebrew is not a secret language, and there are enough good people who know the language and are willing to translate what is being said. So this is exposed publicly in any case. Let me conclude and say that any AI connection to sources, whether they are journalistic, encyclopedic, or scholarly have to be aware that there is a war of narratives that is reflected in the language of the sources. And it is the result of the struggle between the settler colonial project and the anti-colonial movement. And there is not such thing as a neutral language. In a bizarre way, the AI will have to adopt almost a moral position here in the end of the day. Otherwise, oppression and counter-oppression will be addressed as two legitimate sides of the coin. And we see that problem in the Western academia and mainstream media, where the equation between Israeli actions and Palestinian action, in the end of the day, does not create equality. What it creates is demonization of the Palestinians and absolution for the Israeli, or immunity for the Israeli action. That is the case when there is an attempt to equate the two sides. Usually the language betrays, like the language of the BBC or the New York Times, betrays that even that equality is not being attempted, when there is always a mentioning of the names of Israeli who were killed and not the mention of any Palestinian names. And it's always, the Israelis are always killed and the Palestinians just die. And all these are important differences that I don't have time to go into, and they deserve really a different kind of lecture. But I hope what I try to say is that we have to be aware of how far the eliminatory and denialism, eliminatory language and the denialism, which is part of the Israeli scholarly, political and cultural preference to the Palestinians, how much of it has entered the very resources that would be used in the future in order to help people to formulate argument, to search for information in the name of understanding the origins of the conflict and the ways to solve it. And this would really mean that there needs to be this kind of awareness of how much the settler colonial project itself created a settler colonial language that still is very prevalent as legitimate and the only way of describing what happened in the past, what is happening in the present, and what we should think about the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ilan. Very interesting. So we get actually some questions. I will be reading like 2 by 2, if you allow me. So there is the first question. You use the term Hasbara to refer to the ways in which Israel controls narratives. And now we see such Hasbara is influencing AI systems, like because they are biased, which is deeply concerning. So the question is, how does Hasbara impact social media and mainstream media, as also the education system in Israel? So this is a question, and there is another related question. I will ask them together.
Yes,
do you
please.
believe that academics, in particular Western countries, are telling the truth about the ongoing Nakba? And do you think that the academic literature is reliable, or it is heavily influenced by the Israeli propaganda?
Is this refers to academia in general or in Israel?
So the first one is about the social media and mainstream media and the education system in Israel. Is it influenced by the Hasbara? Also about the Western academia and literature. Is it reliable or also influenced?
Okay, so the second one refers to the Western in general. Yeah, so let me start with the first one. Definitely the Hasbara, so the propaganda or the attempts to sell the Israeli narrative as the truth is not limited to the outside, to the globe itself, but is also constantly used through the systems that the state has to indoctrinate and educate people, from official educational system, TV channels, and socialization processes in the army, ceremonies of the state. And as I mentioned also, which only recently I found out how important are the synagogues in Israel in this kind of Hasbara, if you want, through the rabbis. And Israel is a far more religious and traditional society than it was. So the synagogues are very important nowadays. I would not have mentioned the synagogues in Israel in the 1950s. Very few people attended them. But now there's a huge number of young people who attend synagogues, and they are really sites of incitement, racist incitement of the highest level. So this is all reflected in this, first of all, in the social media for sure. Although the social media is the only place in Israel where you might find counter narratives, which you won't find in the mainstream media. The mainstream media is very consensual, it's very careful, especially after the 7th of October. I mean, there are some exceptions, like some writers in Haaretz, but Haaretz is not a widely read newspaper in Israel, so you can't take it as a reflection of what Israelis read, either online or in a printed manner. The most important source of information for Israelis are the television channels, the 4 television channels that exist, and they all talk in one voice. And they all reflect this kind of dehumanization that I was talking about. So it has a huge impact on the current society, but my greatest fear is that it also educates the next generation. And that's very worrying. As for the second question, the situation there is more complex. Since the last 20 years, actually academics in the West who are interested in Palestine through their various disciplines, whether they are sociologists, historians, anthropologists, economists, tend to be actually much more pro-Palestinian than the previous generation. So the academia more and more, it's not over yet, but more and more reflects the Palestinian narrative and the Israeli narrative in all the places where the history of Palestine is being taught, or where the current situation of Palestine is analyzed. Now, I'm generalizing. Of course, there are still many places, especially in Germany, Italy, and France. I would single out these three states in Western Europe where what I described now is not happening. Not to mention Central Europe and Eastern Europe, where I looked at what people read in the academia. I looked at the reading list of their courses and the little that there is in high school books. It's a total reflection of the Israeli narrative, and there's very little room there for the Palestinian narrative. But in the English-speaking world in particular, and in Scandinavia, and in Spain, and in Portugal, for instance, not to mention the global south, the academia has much more faith in the way Palestinians describe the past and the present than the Israelis, which is really a reversal of what we had in the 70s and the 80s. If you read the late Edward Said description of American academia in the 1980s, it was exactly the opposite. So that should encourage us, because that is really important. Academia, with all its weaknesses and limitation, influences textbooks, influences curriculum in schools, maybe even influence, in the end of the day, politicians and journalists as well. So that's one of the positive development in a very difficult time for all of us.
Okay. Thank you. So, Nizar, before I read the other questions.
Oh, sure. Ilan, it was a pleasure listening to you.
Thank you.
And I really want to thank you particularly for sharing insights on understanding of Israeli society which is really hard to kind of understand from the outside for people who are not aware of the language, as you mentioned a few times. One particular thing that you mentioned really roused my attention when you talked about the cognitive dissonance among the early Zionists, or at least the people who in the 1940s, were refugees that came from Europe to Palestine, and the language that they were using. And I wanted to ask you about that and the use of language, because in the same period, just a few years before, there was a lot of Jewish resistance against the Nazis, right? I mean, there were demonstrations in the ghettos, and there were a lot of examples of Jewish resistance. And I'm curious, because I don't have the same level of access to Hebrew. My Hebrew is really very, very basic. How do Israelis talk about that period? What kind of language, where there is a language of resistance of some form, in that context versus the context of the Palestinians? And also, I wanted to ask you if you could elaborate about something that was in your abstract about Zohot, I believe, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, and the current efforts happening in Israeli society, because it sounds like a very important part of peacemaking for all of us is the language has to adjust and the awareness has to be increased. I hope my question is coherent. It's a kind of between the past, the present, and the future. I appreciate your insights on this. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. So let me first of all talk about the transformation that you are rightly describing of people who are either part of the resistance to the Nazis or are victims of the Nazis and surviving extermination camps or Nazi occupation, and then they come and become almost instantly themselves victimizers and not victims. And I think one of the things that the Zionist leaders were very aware of was of the need to integrate quickly, almost from the moment these immigrants came on shore to Haifa, to immediately integrate them into the military effort, so that, the kind of temporality that they were experiencing, namely that they were already immediately in a battle with the Palestinians. And once you are in a battle, or with the Arab armies, for that matter, if they came after the 15th of May, 1948, that when you are immediately thrown into this, it's easier to try and indoctrinate you that you are fighting the successors of the Nazis, actually. Now, you have to remember that all the military units of the Haganah, the paramilitary Zionist organization before the 15th of May 1948, and the IDF after the 15th of 1948, had politruks. They had political officers, a notion that they have copied, emulated from the Soviet army. So there was, and their role was actually to talk to these refugees, if you want, Jewish refugees, and make sure that they understand who they are facing. And they came without any knowledge about Palestine. They had no idea. They had no idea what was going on there before, and so on. So they were a bit of a tabula rasa, to speak so, and they were more easily indoctrinated, I think, in that respect. And very few of them could make the logical connection between what was done to them and what they were doing to the Palestinians. One of the most horrific, it's not about language, but I think it answers your first question in a good way, and I'm afraid. One of the worst things I heard in my oral history projects, which I did with Israeli troops of 1948, was people telling me that they were asking refugees, especially women refugees, who survived the Holocaust, to help them search Palestinian women after they were expelled from their villages, because they would know where women would hide their jewelry or the gold or their more valuable possessions. So they were functioning almost exactly a kind of a mirror image of what they were experiencing themselves. And I asked them, did it not occur to you what, especially because they were treating women, not soldiers. And it seems that they created this bluntness in their mind that enabled them to dehumanize them so much. As for your second question, yes, Zochrot is a very important NGO that tries to educate the Israelis about the Nakba through visiting destroyed villages, producing leaflets and information. It is not a popular NGO, as you can imagine, but it persists, which is good. And from my experience, joining them many times, unfortunately, I don't see any enlargement of the groups that come. It seems to be the same usual suspects who come to these visits. But I do hope that in the future, better process of, I wouldn't even call it peace, maybe decolonization, such an NGO would play an important role, using the Hebrew language to rectify past evils rather than perpetuating them.
Thank you, Ilan. I have another two related questions that I will read them together. So the first question, you mentioned that the Israeli lexicon of dehumanization did not work as well in other languages as it did in Hebrew. Why do you think that was? And another question, do you have an example in mind? Do you think this was a reflection of loss of support of the Israeli colonial project or part of the reason for this loss of support? So this is the first question I get. The second one, AI technologies like machine translation enable us to understand Hebrew without knowing the language. Can you say that such innovations suggest that Israel is losing control of the public narrative? Could you comment on this?
Yeah, definitely. So for the first one, I think that what happens when you translate these words, if you want, to English, or whole sentences, the receiver of the information, whoever they are, have something in mind that Israelis don't have. And that's a comparative context. Namely, they don't treat it as a unique case. Most of these people who were targeted by the Hasbara, if you want, were aware of similar oppressions in the past, maybe in their own societies. And therefore, I think they did not buy into a laundrette of words that tries to say that shooting with live ammunition a demonstrator is a targeted, whatever they called it, elimination, for that matter, or that dispossessing people can really be described as creating a green lung in the midst of the West Bank. People were too knowledgeable, both in terms of what was happening on the ground and both in what was happening historically and temporarily in similar situation. In fact, what really defeats this kind of propaganda is that Israel is not unique, not as a settler colonial project, not as a military occupier, not as a colonizer, and not as an oppressor. Unfortunately, the Palestinians are not the only victims of the world of dehumanization and oppression. And therefore, I think it doesn't work. The moment you take it out of the particularly context that the Israelis believe is very unique to themselves. I can give one example, which is very interesting, that never worked for the Israelis. There was a point when the Israeli academia understood that it would be very difficult to challenge the equation of Zionism with colonialism. And the reason was that those of us who began to be critical about it were using Hebrew sources of the early Zionists. And the early Zionists called their project colonialism. Herzl in his diary said, we are creating a colonialist project in Palestine. And the early Zionists called their settlements colonies. And they were selling wines from the Jewish colonies in Palestine in order to make money. So it was very difficult to deny. At first we were, blamed of being traitors or stupid or whatever, but the sources talked for themselves. In Hebrew, they said, oh no, there's a difference between colonization, which is what all the Gentiles are doing, and colonizatorische, whatever. They invented a word in Hebrew that has the word I can't even pronounce it without going to the dentist. It's such a fabrication of the word colonization in order to give it, if you want, a moral colonization, a justified colonization. Now, if you translate it into English, it's ridiculous. It sounds ridiculous from the outset, and therefore it didn't work at all. Remind me, Mustafa's second question.
So the second question was the AI technologies and machine translation.
Oh yeah.
Enable us to understand.
Yeah. It's this is where I think we enter this interesting gap between language and discourse. Yeah. It's very. I wonder how would such technicalities deal with the more profound meaning of language. I'll give you an example. Israelis never talk about Jewish immigration. They talk about something that Google Translator would translate into ascendance, aliyah. They don't talk about hagira. Hagira in Hebrew is immigration. Aliyah is ascending, going up. Now, it can sound very stupid in a Google Translator. Leaving Israel is not immigrating from Israel. It's yerida, it's going down. The opposite of ascendance. So the translator would miss, I think, this point. The whole vocabulary of the Zionists, for example, land is never bought in Israel. It's always redeemed. It's redeemed. Even if the act of redemption is not just buying a land, it's dispossessing people from their homes, it will not be called in Hebrew dispossession. It will not even be called purchase. It will be called redemption or redeeming. So I wonder whether this is possible at this level of translators that we have to really convey properly this kind of interpretation. It's possible that AI, through its projects of translation, is a bit more sophisticated because of the way it connects to reservoirs and pools of information. But as I say, one of my sons, at least, is all the time doing AI things for various reasons. And he tried that. And it looked quite ridiculous, I must say. At this level, the outcome was not very impressive in terms. Namely, he took a loaded Hebrew text, which had a lot of ideological, implicit and explicit meanings about the Palestinians. And it came out as if it went through a launderette. It became very clean in the English translation, but you couldn't understand what really the essence of that text was. Okay. I'm not talking about the present language, and that's what I said in my talk. The present language of the new political elite of Israel is ideal for direct translation because they're not using euphemism, they're not using diversions, they're not trying to hide. And there the translation works very well, actually. You don't need to know Hebrew. You can really use very confidently a Google Translator, for instance. But if you want to understand why Israel was immunized for so many years when the old elite was controlling Israel, the most social democratic elite that was respected in the world and the world provided it immunity for the Nakba of 1948 and everything that went until the genocide in Gaza. I don't think a direct translation will do the job.
Thank you. I get a lot of questions, so I will also read other two questions quickly. So regarding so it said, during the Israeli war in Gaza, the AI systems have been extensively used, resulting in the death of tens of thousands of innocent civilians. Could you comment on the potential violation of international law and ethical principles related to the use of artificial intelligence? How might international bodies address such issues to ensure accountability and justice? Another related question says, what do you think could be potential effects that you foresee to current AI techniques being weaponized by the Israeli state in the authorization of the Palestinians? So basically,
Yeah.
how to face AI, what
Yeah.
AI ethics we should use. So if you can comment on this.
Yeah, I think that there is an interesting campaign before the AI that did not work well, but is worth looking at. Some people I know, even personally, who are international jurists, were trying to face Israel with all kinds of new techniques, such as facial recognition, eavesdropping to people's phones, um, drone technology. And as I understood, for them, their attempts to go to international tribunals and claiming that that technology or the usage of that technology is a violation of international law was less successful so far. And maybe it's part of the major crisis we have with international law. It is, you have to remember, we have here a set of regulation and assumptions that were formulated in the 1940s with some adaptation in the early 1960s, but were never properly adapted to either new technologies or, for instance, even to projects such as settler colonialism as a problem for international law. So I think that I wouldn't raise much hopes for bringing that into the ICC or ICJ. You can see from the main successes of the ICC and ICJ since the attack on Gaza began, that it is very much very much relies on examining the more conventional actions of human beings against other human beings, namely executions, lack of medical help, destruction of schools, and so on. I haven't seen any reference, but I might have missed it, but I haven't seen any reference to any technology apart from the drone technology. But even that is very minimized in it. And this is very important, and it relates also to the second question. I think it's connected. Israel is a high-tech nation, still is. And we've seen its abilities with what it did to the smartphones and beepers in Lebanon. And I think that one of the things that is worth looking at, especially for the BDS movement, the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement, is exactly how universities in the West are invested knowingly or unknowingly in small particles that are actually very crucial for the final product. And the final product could be very lethal and dehumanizing and illegal almost, according to the international law. I can give you an example. I mean, we discovered in Britain that universities, again, I don't know if knowingly or unknowingly, were collaborating with a certain department in the University of Tel Aviv that actually was responsible for producing the most important element in one of the many drones that Israel used in the Gaza Strip, that according to Dr. Abu Sita, who is now the rector of Glasgow University and who operated in Gaza, he said that this particular drone inflicted the worst kind of wounds on people. And we try to explain to these people in Britain how complicit they are actually in this final outcome. So I think if you are campaigning on this, it's very important to see the whole picture, the whole trajectory. The end result, and who else it's a modular thing, isn't it? So who else is complicit and in what way? And I think this could be a very effective assignment for exerting pressure in Israel. Of course, we have now a ceasefire for a few hours, and I don't know how long it will last, but unfortunately, I'm convinced that the Israeli violations of human rights and civil rights towards the Palestinian, with or without the ceasefire, would continue. And therefore, we should be aware of that as well.
Thank you. I have lots of questions, but I will end up with the last question, if you allow me, because we are running out of time. Well, no, two questions. So, because people are pushing me. So, given the current political climate, do you see any meaningful change in the global recognition of the Nakba and the Palestinian struggle? If so, what might drive these changes? And the last question, which is related to Trump. So, given the long-standing historical dynamics of U.S. foreign policy towards Israel, how do you think the election of Donald Trump affected the Palestinian Nakba?
Yeah.
So what is next, basically?
Yeah. Let me start with the first question, which really is very much at the heart of what I do all my life. Area, my whole life is devoted against the Nakba denial. I'm now trying to build the first ever center against Nakba denial in London. I have already created a charity that works against the Nakba denial in the West, and particularly in Britain. So the fact that I'm involved in this project means that there's a lot of work still to be done. So the Nakba is still denied, and it's and as much as I provided my own explanation in writing, and many good colleagues of mine did the same, it still bewilders us. The level of denial and ignorance about the 1948 Nakba, at the level of political elites, institution, even mainstream media. I think there's far more awareness in the alternative media, and of course, in the world of the solidarity movements with the Palestinians. It is there, and as I mentioned before, it begins to enter finally some of the more important centers of academic learning in the world, and I'm very happy about that. But we still need, there's a lot of work to be done there. And I think for different societies, there are different reasons why the Nakba is denied, and I don't have time to explain for each society. So let me just say two sentences of Europe, especially Western Europe. It's very clear for me that the denial of the Nakba is connected to the connection and complicity of Europe in creating the Jewish state in Palestine. After all, Zionism was a European solution for a European problem, the Jewish problem. And Europe was very happy to solve its racism against the Jews by allowing the Zionist movement to colonize Palestine. And the moment you are talking about the Nakba, you open up all these questions of responsibility, accountability, and complicity. And therefore, I think there is very a lack of willingness to open up this conversation. It is quite incredible that it is still denied, even by a younger generation who should be aware that this is not connected to them directly, but they are faced with the intimidation of the Israeli lobby. But it's a very good question, and I devoted more than 20 years to answering it. So maybe we can have a separate webinar on it. It deserves a far more elaborate answer, and it's not shouldn't be taken for granted. It's not simple to say, oh, they denied the Nakba. It's understandable. No, it's not understandable. Totally not understandable. But we need to discuss it because I think that's a very important issue. Finally, Trump. Who knows what Trump is doing? I just read a book by a colleague of mine called Trump 2.0, claiming that this Trump is different from Trump 1.0 in terms of bringing to the fore the whole world of business into the foreign policy. Namely, it's all deals. It's all deals. Will it change much for the Palestinians? I doubt it. I'm afraid that my way of being an optimist is related to the fact that I'm an historian. And for me, 4 years is not a period worth bothering about too much. But of course, for the people who suffer on the ground, another 4 years is terrible to think about it. But I'm afraid it would be irresponsible to say to people that in any place, whether it's Britain, America, even in the Eastern Mediterranean, the Mashrek, or anywhere else, that the period of the next 4 years is the period of change. I think it would be irresponsible to say it. It's a continuation. The good news from my perspective is it's a continuation of a phase that is about to end. It's not the beginning of a new period, it's the end of a very bad period for the Palestinians. But the end of a period is very bad in itself. I do believe in the long run. In the long run, there are processes, including in the United States, including among the Jewish community in the United States, including among the younger generations of educated Americans, including among the minorities in the United States that are almost a majority now. There are processes that would benefit the Palestinians in the long run, but not in the short run. And to make sure that these processes are beneficial, of course, also the Palestinians have to create the infrastructure that would know how to exploit these positive changes, because they will come. They will come. But it's difficult to persuade people when you are honest with them and you tell them, I'm not talking about next year, and I'm not talking the year after. I have to be honest. But of course, who knows? Maybe something good will happen in a shorter period. But Trump 2.0 is not better news than Trump 1.0 for the Palestinians. Neither was Biden 1.0 such a good news for the Palestinians either. So basically, American administration have very little to offer. Probably the best we can offer, cannot offer. The best with this I will end. The best we can hope for is maybe for less American intervention in our life in historical Palestine than more intervention. That might be a beginning of a positive development.
Okay, thank you very much, Ilan. Very insightful talk. And actually, I want to mention that the way you explored how words are used, shaped, and contested in the political and cultural discourse on the Nakba is directly relevant to our research area, which is natural language processing, and how we understand bias and propaganda and so on. This is all, the whole workshop was also about such things today. So this is actually the last even activity in our workshop today. So thank you very much. It was an honor to have you.
Thank you. It was very nice talking and meeting you all, and I hope we'll continue this in the future. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All the best. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. So now we will have the last session, but very short. So this is the closing session, and so there is not much to say except that clearly we need to have our hands together to start collecting data sets to go to the next Nakba workshop in the next year and so on. So if there's anybody want to say something, any suggestion, so very welcomed in this closing session.
So I wonder, well, first of all, thank you, Mustafa, for all the work that you've done on this. I mean, this is really was well, this was your brainchild, I have to say. I remember the first time we talked about it about a year and a half ago or so. So thank you for everything that you've done to bring everybody together. It's amazing. I wonder if we should create some kind of a mailing list, at least, from the people who are here. And particularly, I hope we can continue the connection with the question I asked Camille in the morning about connecting to people who actually hold the keys to the treasures, you know, that are there, because that can help us speed up the process of adding more to them even. And you know, so I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much. And thanks to all the speakers.
Yeah, and to the attendees also.
Absolutely.
We are actually today, we were on time. All sessions were really on time. So this is amazing. And all of them stayed with us. So this is very good. So any suggestion? So we will do the mailing list. So first of all, yeah. This is an action for you today. Other suggestions? Terry, please.
So I just want to, excuse me, I just want to second what Nizar just said. Thank you very much for organizing this. I guess one question, I guess two questions ultimately. So about the past and the future. I'm curious. Maybe you said this at the opening, but like I was asleep. So I'm curious if there's anything it would be useful to say about kind of how this came about, like what the observations were that motivated you to do this. I'm very grateful that it did happen. So that's about the past. And about the future, like, are there concrete plans for, 2.0? And sort of, or is that what the mailing list is about?
Actually, it was in our mind many times to organize something for Palestine. In the past, actually, we studied at Birzeit University something called iArabic Symposium. It's a natural language processing within Palestine, but not much politics, let's say. And then, the cause was also what happened in Gaza was also pressuring us, and we didn't expect, actually, to be honest, such workshops to be accepted in computer science conferences, because such workshops is like thematic and not general computer science. But there was actually a workshop I want to mention last year called Holocaust. We saw it, so we say, well, now if we apply to have a workshop in a prestigious conference like Calling, so then it will be accepted. And it actually was welcomed even in the
to add to Mustafa, I mean, it was called Holocaust Testimonies as Language Resources. You can almost see a similarity between Nakba narratives, where I think Nakba narratives is more appropriate actually in the context as opposed to testimonies, because it's actually, in my mind, it's, all the narrative from both sides about this, eliminatory and supportive narratives. And I still remember the conversation, to answer your question, Terry. It was in Calling 2024, in fact. So it was also in Calling last year. And I still recall standing with Mustafa next to a metro station in Italy, arguing, talking about this for some time. And we realized the biggest problem was that the word Nakba is just a foreign term that means nothing to most people. Whereas the word Holocaust, it has an immediate recognition form for it. I'm not trying to make any claims about equivalence, or really, this is kind of a lot more complicated, but just from the simple recognition of something so important to a people. And that's kind of where this was born. And I definitely give credit to Mustafa for bringing up the question to start with.
Thank you. Thanks. So we realized after we get lots of submissions, we didn't expect this, so high number of submissions, and from diverse subfields like corpus linguistics. So, for example, this was not really that common in our computer science conferences, but this is lovely. So we get good submissions, quality paper. So we hope that it will also continue. We actually hope to start promoting the idea of open source datasets for the Nakba. So this is very important to enable research. So even in Arabic, I start to say الدراسات الفلسطينية الرقمية. So not مؤسسة الدراسات لحالها بس فلسطينية, but so Palestinian digital studies.
Digital studies, yeah.
Something like this. So we will be in contact. Thank you very much for staying the whole time with us. So